get things started here. We're going to talk just a little bit about some of the research that's been done here and a little bit about performance. I'm John Diana. I'm the outgoing research director. Megan Roche and Emily Krause are coming in to take over for me. They're good hands, and they've been doing some research for us. Anyway, welcome for all of you that are doing the race and haven't been here before. And with that, I'll let Megan and Emily come up and talk about a few things we've been doing. For those of you who aren't aware, there's actually been a lot of support from Western states for the last 2 decades supporting research studies for performance, for athletes, nutrition, and all kinds of different questions that need to be answered. And so when you see new things about nutrition improvements, and even the time I've been running these things for about 12 years, and from the time I started to now, the knowledge base is so much greater from, with the athletes when they come in, to the race, knowing like what to expect, how to take care of, their hydration better, electrolytes, things like that. So I think these research studies are really, they form the basis for really coming up with all the answers that we can use practically later. So the Western States, fortunately, board is very supportive of that process. And so anyway, we'll have Megan and Emily come on up. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John. It's such an honor to be here today. I think looking at the research that comes out of Western states, it is foundational for the field of ultra running. And I think we're really excited just to build off all the progress that's been made. So thank you for being here. This is the best time of year. This is like truly a holiday week here at Western States. So thank you for braving the rain to coming to our talk today. So we really appreciate it.
Yeah, and John, thank you. You've been the research director for the last 7 years. And I know that was longer than you expected to be holding that position, but you did a fantastic job. And I remember in 2018, when we first did our initial study here, it was so great communicating with you and getting feedback and really understanding the lay of the land. And now I've learned a lot, even just from interacting with you, so that we can try to fill your shoes. I think between Megan and my feet, we might be able to do that, but we'll definitely still be working with you a lot this next year. So should we dive into our talk?
Yep.
Okay. So today, we're going to talk about the prevalence of triad risk factors and exploring associations with specific biomarkers and performance in Western states runners. We'll go through a lot of these definitions. If you don't understand anything, I really want this to be interactive. And just raise your hand if you're like, Emily, you're talking too fast. Megan and I usually talk on like 2x speed. So if we need to slow down a little bit, we are happy to do that. Wanted to give a big shout out to our research team. We've got Abby over here, one of our research coordinators, woo woo. And we also have a couple of other med students who've worked with us and another research coordinator. And it's really cool. We had representation from Kentucky. We have a student who works at Harvard, and then of course at Stanford, and even kind of throughout even the Napa area as well. So should we, anything else?
Let's dive in. Yeah, and really just thank you to the Western States Research Foundation. The funding was really pivotal for making this study happen. And we're going to talk at the end about how this study has inspired future studies and what we're thinking about in terms of making this study into a longitudinal study. So the initial funding was really like a big seed for us in terms of how we think about ideas and how we think about research. And we wouldn't be here today without the Western States Research Foundation. So thank you so much. We'll do a quick dive into our backgrounds. I will start first. I'll actually address real quick. I have to speak in a mask, and I'm terribly sorry about that. It's hard to lip read. Unfortunately, I'm immunosuppressed and pregnant, so I'm just trying to be extra cautious, but it does get a little like soupy in here, so it's some nice heat training as I present. So thank you for your patience on that. My background, so I'm a physician. I'm taking a very untraditional path in the medical world. I'm doing a PhD in epidemiology at Stanford. In that journey, 7 years ago, I met Emily as a young medical student. She was a resident, I was a medical student, and that relationship has been pivotal as we've worked together to form the FASTER research team, which I will let her expand on.
Yeah, so Megan and I met 7 years ago. It was a student-run clinic, and she was a student there, and we connected right away from running, and we invited her to be one of our research coordinators for one of our Healthy Runner project, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a few more slides. And so I'm the director of a research program called FASTER at Stanford. FASTER stands for Female Athlete Science and Translational Research. It's part of a bigger initiative called the WSER Human Performance Alliance, and that involves 6 different institutions, and so we have funding dedicated towards studying the female athlete. And I pulled on Megan very early when I found out that I was going to be leading the FASTER program and asked her to be the lead researcher, and it's been a wonderful journey so far. And throughout this talk, it'll be really fun. Megan and I are going to be handing off, so Megan gets some time to catch her breath, and same for me, even without a mask. And we'll be kind of wearing different hats. So I'll be wearing my clinician hat, Megan will be wearing her coach hat and her epidemiology hat, and hopefully you get a little bit of a perspective on some of our approach and strategy with our research.
And real quick, too, at the end of this presentation, we have some really interesting analyses of data that's looked at performance at Western states. And if any of you out here are racing Western states, it may actually be impactful in terms of how you pace and how you race. So it'll be really exciting to get to bring together this research and tie it into performance. We'll have a special guest come up at the end, too.
All right, so yeah, we're not used to like mic handing off, so this will be fun. But so I wanted to start by giving a little bit of background. There are a lot of definitions, and I don't want this to be like a science class where you're feeling like you're being lectured to. So I'll try to make this applicable and interesting for you all. But we use the word triad a lot in this talk, and for us, triad stands for the female athlete triad and the male athlete triad. And back in the 1980s, the female athlete triad term was coined, and then it's evolved over time. And the latest definition also includes the male athlete triad, which was just recently published on in a consensus statement in the last couple of years. And so it's defined as 3 interrelated conditions. One is low energy availability with or without disordered eating or an eating disorder. So what is that? So that could be overtraining, so training too high, maybe training an increase in training without really matching those fueling or nutrition needs. That could be an underlying eating disorder that an athlete may or may not know that they have, or they may not have that formal diagnosis. And we see this a lot in athletes and in endurance athletes, and I'll share a little bit more about that in a few more slides. And the second condition, or the second part of the triad, is functional hypothalamic amenorrhea. So that's a mouthful that actually means menstrual dysfunction or irregular periods in females. And so that can be missed periods in females, or that could be a delay in the first period in females in their high school years. And so we see this often. There's a misconception that when an athlete goes through a certain degree of training or intensity, that it's normal to lose her period, but that's not the case, and we really want to try and shift that view and shift that mindset. And then in men, we see a similar condition called functional hypothalamic hypogonadism. So it's another mouthful that really leads to hormonal suppression, such as suppression in testosterone, impaired sperm formation, and other hormonal suppression. And lastly, over time, that hormonal suppression can lead to effects on bone health. And that can mean impaired bone health, such as such as a type of stress fracture or a stress reaction or bone stress injury. Or it can even be low bone mineral density over time. And so that's usually measured with a DEXA scan, so it's a special type of imaging study. And a lot of athletes don't have access to DEXA scanners, so sometimes they present with a bone stress injury or stress reaction or stress fracture in my clinic. And then we get to this diagnosis of the female or male athlete triad.
Athletes may have also heard of the condition called relative energy deficiency in sport, or REDS. And sometimes there's actually a little bit of confusion of, do I have triad or do I have the REDS? But it's really important that these are actually very similar processes, and that low energy availability is the foundation of both of them. So oftentimes, and this is almost 100% the case, that an athlete who has a triad will have REDS. And so that's just a helpful way to clear up any confusion on this. So REDS is expanded on the female athlete triad, and it goes in and it provides more clarity on some of the long-term sequelae of low energy availability. So oftentimes physicians were seeing athletes coming in with any number of conditions. So these could be cardiologic, gastrointestinal, immunologic, bone health, as we talked about, metabolic. So low energy availability really provides this pathway for this unfortunate long-term sequelae that happen across many, many systems. And so you can see actually, so the diagram on the left up here, that describes what's happening in terms of like the bodily process level, whereas the diagram on the right indicates performance. So this is always something that I think is really helpful to explain to athletes, is that REDS impacts performance too. And I think that's really the driving factor in what enables athletes to seek treatment, and something that can be really helpful in terms of talking from a clinician and a coach standpoint.
Yeah, and just to add on that a little bit, I mean, you can see that triangle, that triad right there. So that low energy availability, as Megan said, is that foundation for both. And the challenge with RED specifically is it's a little newer term, and so it gets a little confusing when they're both used or used kind of one and then the other. But this has been around since 2014, and there's a lot of great research that's coming out on the RED specifically to help clinicians and teams and coaches understand earlier screening tools and just to better understand categorization. So we'll kind of get into a little bit of categorization and clearance in a few more slides. It's my preview, teaser. All right, so what is the prevalence of the female athlete triad in endurance runners? So we see similar prevalence or similar numbers of athletes who present with female athlete triad in cross-country and track and field collegiate runners as we do in ultra runners. So this study at the Comrades Marathon study found a prevalence of 44% in female endurance runners with the triad. We do one of our studies at Stanford and UCLA, the Healthy Runner Project, is a dual center study that Megan and I have both been research coordinators as part of that journey, and it's a 7-year prospective, so that's a future study. And we looked at different triad risk factors and overall triad risk and that relationship with future bone stress injury or stress reaction or stress fracture. And we found that for every 1 point increase in that overall triad risk score, that there was a 17% increase in future bone stress injury risk in females and a 37% risk of future bone stress injury risk in males.
And that's an amazing segue into bone stress injuries in general. So unfortunately, I see a lot of bone stress injuries as a coach. Emily sees a lot of bone stress injuries as a practitioner, as a clinician, and they're quite common in runners. So bone stress injuries range from stress reactions. So typically we think of stress reactions. There's a 4-point grading scale for bone stress injuries. Stress reactions are often grade 1, grade 2. Stress fractures are more often grade 3, grade 4. These can be pretty devastating injuries. So athletes might be out 2-3 weeks for a grade 1, whereas they might be out 2, 3, 4 months for a grade 4. And that's why it's really important to think about prevention measures and making sure that athletes aren't progressing to these long-term consequences of impacts on bone health. In track, cross-country runners, very common locations are tibia and metatarsals, and certainly we see those in ultramarathon runners as well. But because of the nature of the downhill, there's tons of downhill forces that ultramarathon runners are encountering. And because of that, we often see stress fractures a little bit more higher up in the body. So we think about the femoral neck and the hip. We think about the lumbar spine, the sacrum in the back. And so we see those stress fractures kind of coming up the body because of the sheer downhill forces as well. So we know that the prevalence of bone stress injuries is about 21% in track runners, and actually a study at the Two Oceans Marathon showed a parallel prevalence of 21% in ultramarathon runners. So it was interesting to see that kind of side-by-side duality with track runners and ultramarathon runners presenting with similar prevalence. In addition, so up to 22% of bone stress injuries are recurrent. So an athlete gets one, and they're immediately at risk for another. And that's why it's extra important to think about prevention. And these are often season-ending injuries, too.
Yeah. And just a little anatomy lesson in case tibia and metatarsals are new phrases. But we got tibia, shin bone, metatarsals are some of those long foot bones, and they can be really frustrating for an athlete, especially when they're coming into the middle of their training, and then that's when they land in my clinic, or the athlete reports to maybe Megan or another coach, and it's like, my shin's been really hurting in that same spot, and you hate to hear it because that's probably going to end that athlete season. And so the more that we can understand the why, the more that we can try and prevent. So that goes into our study. So our primary aim, so that's kind of our primary goal for this research, was to investigate the prevalence of triad risk factors and bone stress injury history in male and female 100-mile endurance runners at the Western States race. We had a secondary aim of exploring associations between these triad risk factors and bone stress injury history in these athletes. And then our other secondary aim was to explore the relationship between these triad risk factors, different endocrine biomarkers, so blood biomarkers, and performance.
And to do this, we were fortunate, and again, thank you to the Western States Research Foundation, we were fortunate to recruit 3 different cohorts of athletes. So we had athletes competing at Western States from 2018, 2019, and 21. And we obviously tried 2020, but no one was here in 2020 due to COVID. We had kind of 3 different prongs of our study, and grateful for the athletes because this required, a decent amount of study participation, but athletes were really engaged in terms of learning about their overall health. So we started with a questionnaire. We sent this questionnaire about 2 months before the study, before the race day. This looked at an extensive training history, injury history, health history, for female athletes, menstrual cycle history. We also looked at something called the EDEQ, and this is an eating disorder examination questionnaire. And we use this to evaluate pathologic behaviors of eating. So looking at dietary restraint, looking at different eating behaviors that may be indicative of low energy availability. In addition, so we did DEXA measurements. It's really interesting here at Western States. There's like these whole vans, these fleets of vans that are parked of runners, and we had 2 body spec trucks there, in addition to those fleets of vans. And we were using those vans to measure bone mineral density in the total body, lumbar spine, and then other parts of the body as well. In addition, we did serum lab draws, and so we worked with Inside Tracker to measure vitamin D, ferritin, estradiol, and a number of other markers too.
Oh, we have the impact of the thunder right now. It's so
right?
exciting. Yes. And yeah, definitely a big shout out to those body spec. So we had 2 DEXA scanners, and we had these blood draws that were happening in another location. So shout out, this is where our research coordinators and the whole team, and John even helped with some of the recruitment and registration or consenting of athletes. And it was a well-oiled machine. We had these athletes going through their DEXA scan, getting their blood draws. They even let me use the centrifuge and spin down the blood, and nobody was hurt. There was no blood spilled, and all the data did get, or all the labs and the blood did get delivered to the right location. And just a big thank you to all the coordinators and the athletes for doing those aspects of the study. So I had talked about some different screening tools for the male athlete triad, the female athlete triad, and relative energy deficiency in sport. So for this study, we used this female athlete triad cumulative risk assessment tool, and that was part of a triad coalition consensus statement back in 2014. So it's pretty vetted, and it's been validated in some of our other research as well. And so you can see some of those triad risk factors that I had talked about earlier. And we tried to assess low energy availability through that self-reported, some of those screening tools. So sometimes that's really challenging to really assess without having a sports dietitian or someone really kind of doing a deeper dive. So that was self-reported low energy availability, and some did self-report some degree of disordered eating. Then we did BMI through the DEXA scan is how we obtained that information. We did menstrual cycle questions for the females only, of course, and that was eliminated for the males. And then we assessed low bone mineral density through the DEXA scans, through those bone mineral density scans on site. And so you can see that there are 3 types of Z-scores that are presented here. And so we use Z-scores to help score bone mineral density, matching age and sex for these athletes. And so a lot of times when you think about bone mineral density, you think about osteoporosis. And so that Z-score is actually different than the type of Z-score that we use for athletes who are engaging in pretty significant weight-bearing activity for a long period of time throughout the day. And so for us, less than -1 is considered low bone mineral density. And so we use that score and that cutoff to help score this cumulative risk assessment tool. We put athletes in low, moderate, and high risk, and then we use that information to help stratify and find overall prevalence information.
And diving into the exciting part, so these are the results of our study. Up here, this is Katie Asmuth. She'll be returning to Western States, and I'm really excited to see her in the results. I picked her for the top 3 for podium, so it's exciting to get to overlap these results with all the exciting results that happen at Western States. So we had 56 women and 124 men across these 3 different cohorts, and that distribution of male and female represents the approximate distribution of Western States participants. So often Western States is 20 to 30% female, and 70 to 80% male, and we saw that represented it in the participation in our study. In addition, our men are actually slightly older on average in our study, and you can see that represented in the results. Our population was primarily Caucasian, and that actually parallels the kind of lack of diversity that we see in trail running in general. That's on a trail running level, and I think we're really excited with our FASTER program to be able to expand and really think about diversity efforts in trail running. In addition, so we have about a 50-50 breakdown of competitive age group and professional athletes compared to middle of the pack and back of the pack athletes, and that's really helpful. Actually, we're thinking about stratifying our analyses in some way. And then interestingly enough, actually, our women were training a little bit more than men, both in terms of mileage and then running time per week.
Yeah, and part of that could be related to just the overall competitiveness of the women compared to men in this study. So kind of looking at that, we had 10 women who identified themselves in that competitive range versus 2 men. And so that could also affect their overall training volume. So let's get into the data and the results. So we found when we were looking at that triad cumulative risk score that I shared in that big schematic, that 36% of men and 55% of women were at moderate or high risk of cumulative, so overall risk of the female or male athlete triad. And we found that specifically low energy availability, so that nutrition component of the scoring system, that low energy availability category was the highest risk, with about 37% of men and 53% of women reporting moderate or high risk categories. Interestingly, nearly half of participants reported trying to lose weight for performance. And you may think, well, isn't trying to lose weight for performance to some degree kind of part of the process of training, kind of hitting that race weight? And my answer, like my answer for a lot of things, is it depends. So sometimes it can be a part of that training process, especially if it's pretty calculated, it's done in a gradual manner, and it's then the athlete then can replenish and recover and maybe get to a more stable weight during the rest of training. What we do see and what we get concerned about is when athletes drop into that race weight and stay at that race weight for a long period of time, and that's when maybe that low energy availability state can really start to lead to that hormonal suppression, lead to those menstrual irregularities in females and other hormonal suppression in males, and then lead to that big devastating injury down the road. So I think it's something to think about down the road as far as kind of teasing out, trying to make that race, trying to lose weight for performance, and how that could have both positive and negative consequences. And then we also found that 26% of men and 17% of women were at moderate or high risk for low bone mineral density, using that definition that I talked about earlier. And then looking at overall bone stress injury risks, so this is prior reported bone stress injury. 21% of men and 36% of women were at moderate or high risk for bone stress injury. So this is a prior bone stress injury of at least one, perhaps more bone stress injuries for those athletes.
In addition to our results, we really enjoyed looking at the blood biomarker results. And so we worked with Inside Tracker, which is a company that does blood testing. They came here. It was a little bit difficult, actually. We fit in all 60 athletes from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. to do fasted blood draws the day before the race. So big kudos to the athletes for making that possible, and then for Inside Tracker and for our research team for pulling that off. It was not an easy research feat, to say the least. These numbers are really interesting. And what I think, actually, as I was putting this chart together, I think we could put an asterisk and depends for every single reference range that we're looking at, because reference ranges for biomarkers differ drastically. These differ based off of sex, based off of age, even based off of phase of the menstrual cycle. But I thought it was important to provide some benchmarks in terms of how we compare these. I think, so estradiol depends quite a bit. So that really depends upon menstrual cycle state. So athletes who are premenopausal, postmenopausal, it's really hard to put a range on those estradiol levels. The ferritin actually was a little bit low in women. So even though the reference range says 10 to 120 for female athletes, we really want female athletes to be above 40 to be optimized, and you can see here that the level was a little bit low. In addition, so you can see that the level for ferritin was much higher in male athletes. And then vitamin D is like ferritin as well, where the reference range, the low point is at 30, but we really like for athletes to be optimized, we like for their vitamin D to be above 50. And you can see that both male and female athletes are lower than 50 here for our results.
And this is another area that really drives me crazy when an athlete comes into my clinic and they're like, I feel fatigued, and I went to my primary care doctor and wanted to get my iron checked, and they said no, because my blood counts looked normal on the CBC, so my hemoglobin and hematocrit looked normal. But then you see, then I'll order some extra labs, and their ferritin is in the teens. And then they look at the report and they say, well, this is also normal based on the range. But we got to think about what is an appropriate range for an athlete, and how is that different, and how can we communicate that better? And I think Insight Tracker does a great job of helping interpret and helping those athletes really be an advocate for their own body and help to understand some of this information better. So looking at some associations between some of these triad risk factors and bone stress injury history, so we found that female athletes with low energy availability were at 75% increased risk for prior bone stress injury. And so this is prior bone stress injury, not future bone stress injury, just based on the nature of how we did this research. And I mean, it's hard, but this is called a cross-sectional study. So we've got a snapshot of this athlete through the survey and through this information that we were able to get on site. Athletes with some degree of menstrual irregularity, so that's irregular periods, were at 2 times the risk of prior bone stress injury compared to athletes with regular periods. And so another challenge with this study is some athletes were on hormonal contraception, so the oral contraceptive pill or some other form of hormonal contraception. So that actually reduced our overall numbers of those athletes, and you can see that number 25. So those were the athletes. So we eliminated athletes who were on hormonal contraception. We also had athletes who were perimenopausal or postmenopausal. So they also weren't having periods for other reasons, and so we eliminated those as well. We did find that athletes who, for every 1 mile increase in their training volume, female athletes were at 3% increased risk of prior bone stress injury. There's a lot of variables at play there, so it's really hard to really interpret or make big over kind of general recommendations based on that. In the males, we found that athletes with higher bone mineral density risk, so that's low bone mineral density on those bone scans, were at 2 times the risk of prior bone stress injury compared to those with more normal bone mineral density. And we also saw relationships between age and prior bone stress injury, but as you can imagine, the more years that you accumulate, the more years that you will likely be at risk for bone stress injury, so that's a little less interesting from this research.
We also did a really fun analysis looking at correlations between endocrine biomarkers and these triad risk factors. It was neat to be able to take the serum biomarker levels and then look and compare that to the triad risk that we had collected. Interestingly, in the male population, we found kind of a paradoxical finding. We found that men that were at higher risk for low energy availability actually had higher testosterone levels, and that actually doesn't necessarily parallel the known research that's out there. So research out there generally indicates that men that are at high risk for low energy availability tend to have lower testosterone levels. We did some thinking. We worked with our biostatistician on this, and we were like, why are we seeing this? And what we think it comes down to is that our EDEQ, so our eating disorder examination questionnaire, may have picked up men that were restricting, that were perhaps towards the higher end of the BMI spectrum, and we know that higher BMI is associated with higher testosterone levels. And so that's why we were hypothesizing that we were seeing that finding. In addition, and this is something that is known across the research, we found that morning erections were weakly correlated with higher testosterone levels. And that's a good thing in male athletes. So oftentimes we talk to female athletes about the menstrual cycle, and with male athletes we talk about libido, we talk about morning erections as really important markers of endocrine health and endocrine bioavailability. In addition, for women, we saw that higher risk for low energy availability and higher triad cumulative risk correlated with lower estradiol levels. And this also parallels the known research. We know that low energy availability is closely linked to low estradiol levels, and this is related to bone health and also to the menstrual cycle.
And I tell you what, me doing screenings in my clinic, and I ask all my female athletes about menstrual function, I ask my male athletes about other low energy availability or hormonal suppression, so I'm asking about libido, I'm asking about morning erections, and I have gotten better and less awkward about asking those questions. It definitely helps having a mask because all the blushing that I'm having is covered by half my face. So looking at some of these risk factors and looking at performance, so we found that 73% of females and 77% of males finished the race. For finishing places, on average, women, it was 27.7, and for men, 108. As you can remember from that, the baseline characteristics, females were at kind of more that pro or higher competitive level, so that's not too surprising. We did not find any significant associations with finishing place or time and overall triad cumulative risk score. We'll kind of talk about some of our theories as far as kind of the why behind that And we did find that higher weekly mileage correlated with a better or improved or decreased finishing place in both men and women, and that higher BMI was correlated with worse or increased finishing time. And I think what is beautiful but challenging about Western states is that it's a very heterogeneous, so there's a lot of variety as far as age and training level and just overall kind of competitiveness. And so it's hard to really take a lot away from some of these associations. And Megan and I can talk about, we're very much the we like to disclose everything, and I think that's what makes our research even better, is that we like to kind of find the weaknesses and the challenges within our research to try and learn from that, and also help athletes understand and not take too much from this information.
I think the other thing too is here we are doing this study on triads and REDs, where low energy availability is really perilous for athletes. We know that. And we were quite sad. I ran the data analysis on this, and I got kind of sad to see that fact that the higher BMI was associated with the worst finishing time. But actually, that doesn't hold true across most of ultra-running research. So across other ultra-running research, we know actually that BMI is actually not closely linked to performance. Strength and resilience are really important components of ultra-running performance. And so this was actually something that was surprising for us to see. So addressing some of those limitations, I think Emily and I could stand here all day and go through the limitations of our study. That's kind of, as you were saying, we kind of tend to over-disclose. So to start, this was a cross-sectional study. That means that we're looking at a single snapshot in time. We didn't follow these athletes longitudinally over multiple time points. Our analyses were also exploratory. So this means that we didn't come in with this hypothesis of saying, if we look at this biomarker, it'll improve by 20%. So we really just wanted to explore the general trend of analyses that we were seeing. In addition, we had limited female participation. Unfortunately, this does represent the breakdown of the race, but really excited to see Western states, making more push to recruiting female participants, and that's really exciting. We also relied on self-reported questionnaires. Self-reported questionnaires, whenever you do a self-report, you're relying on the history of the participant themselves, and that has its own limitations. And then we only did the lab evaluations in 2019 and 2021.
Great. So I think now it's fun to talk about the key takeaways, and I'm going to put on my clinician hat here. As I'd mentioned, ultra runners are a heterogeneous population with a lot of special considerations, and so we don't want to make this blanket statement that's going to be this key takeaway and these guidelines that every ultra runner should follow. I think a lot of times, like I said, we say it depends, and I really like to take an individual approach to working with my athletes and think about their goals, think about their training history, and also think about how we can both optimize their health and performance, and also really help them and empower them to know and understand their body, and thinking about menstrual cycle, thinking about different blood biomarkers that maybe they want to learn more about, or maybe kind of trend over time. And so I think really working and reviewing those biomarkers and communicating that with the athlete in the clinic has been really helpful for me, and really helping them understand that something that looks normal on a typical range may not be normal for that athlete. And then really trying to have an open dialogue about fueling and nutrition, and having those more difficult conversations about body image and disordered eating or eating disorder behaviors that maybe just hasn't been uncovered. One of the other challenges with a lot of these athletes is there might have been a prior history of disordered eating or eating disorder way back in adolescence, and really thinking about how that can have long-term implications for bone health down the road. And so having those conversations about their health history and really helping them maybe work with their coach to modify their training volume, or work with that training build up in a little bit more of a gradual way after that maybe injury, to make sure that they don't wind up in my clinic again. And then really using the discussion on performance to be the carrot to maybe get some of this additional information. So I think ferritin is always the easiest one for me to kind of get some of those other labs, like hormonal labs, because athletes often do want to know about their ferritin levels, but sometimes I will explore other labs when I do get that ferritin to just review overall nutrition.
It's really fun to work with Emily because she puts on her researcher clinician and I'll put on my researcher coach hat and talk about different takeaways for athletes. So because of the importance of preventing low energy availability in athletes, we use the phrase often eat enough always in our coaching. It's really, really important to err on the side of caution and not get close to having low energy availability because of the risk of the long-term consequences that we talked about. So that's something that we really, really emphasize with our athletes, and that eating can be fun. This is my dog up here, Addie, and she enjoys eating just as much as we do, which is like quite a lot. And so we try to preach that to our athletes. The other thing is that body image struggles can be normal, but it's important to vocalize or ask for help. I think really normalizing that amongst athletes creates this much better conversation where athletes can be open with practitioners, athletes can be open with coaching staff, and that's something that's really, really helpful. In addition, so paying attention to hormonal cues is another key part. The menstrual cycle is this really beautiful physiology that provides a hormonal cue into what our body is doing. And so the more that you can track that and pay attention to that, the more cues it can give to performance, to health, to these endocrine outcomes, and that's quite helpful. For men, as we talked about, libido, morning erections, these are really important cues for hormonal health. And then also just measuring biomarkers, working with Inside Tracker, working with a physician, working with a coach to think about optimizing biomarkers, super helpful. And then at the end of the day, like, have fun. Let's have some fun on Saturday, let's have some fun in racing, and that's a real key part of this.
All right, so now we get to talk about some exciting ideas. Nothing's solidified yet, but this is what we're brainstorming. And with our FASTER program, we're always brainstorming and talking about what we can do, what we can feasibly do with our research team, and what our needs are. And I think you've heard us talk a lot about blood panels and the importance of really understanding those blood panels and those hormonal markers and how those may differ based on an athlete at different stages in their life, whether this is a premenopausal athlete, a kind of post-collegiate athlete, an athlete who's on hormonal contraception, which is going to suppress a lot of these different sex hormones. Athletes who are maybe in this time of their life where they want to learn about their fertility and be more aware of that and how different training patterns could influence that. The perimenopausal and postmenopausal athlete as well. And so we really want to provide female athletes with insight on these hormonal and performance biomarkers and really try to help them and empower them with this information. And we, of course, want to, as two females and having the FASTER program and also having this be the 50th anniversary of Title IX today, we are emphasizing female athletes, but a lot of this information male athletes can benefit from as well. And we just want this as a starting point to kind of conduct some studies and then make it translatable to both.
And the translatability that you just mentioned is a really key word. And I think in order to make it translatable, it's really helpful to establish these reference range of values that are important in the athletic population. I presented that serum biomarker results graph a couple slides ago, and it had all those asterisks and it depends. And ideally, we can start to get into much more narrow windows of what is considered optimized for athletes, especially for female athletes and especially for female endurance athletes. And so we hope to start first in the endurance population and really develop these ideas of what are common reference ranges for important biomarkers for performance. And then from there, it's about communicating it. I think it's really challenging. Sometimes you walk into a physician and they have no background in ultramarathon and running and even athletic performance. And the more that we can communicate the importance of these biomarkers to physicians, to coaches, it will really help in terms of translating that information.
Yeah, and another an exciting idea and a study design that we have is a longitudinal study. So that a study where we can follow an athlete over time and look at their changes in hormonal biomarkers over time. And Megan and I have some ideas, and we've been really working to see what were some of the limitations and challenges with our current cross-sectional study, and what's going to be the most valuable for an athlete to know and take away. And do you want to?
Yeah, so we're really excited. So we're thinking about, as I mentioned, a limitation of the study that we did was that it was cross-sectional. We were looking at a single snapshot in time. And we really want to work to do a longitudinal study where we repeatedly have these measurements on athletes so we can get an understanding of an athlete's baseline and use that to measure changes off their baseline. That's much more accurate from a scientific perspective. So our goal is to work to recruit 60 female trail runners at Western States and Golden Ticket races, and we'll follow them longitudinally over a period of 6 months. In that 6-month period, we'll test them with blood panels every 2 months, and then we'll also do menstrual cycle status biomarkers every month using ovulation test kits. From there, we'll have them complete monthly surveys, very similar survey to what we used for our study, but completed monthly, and then we'll analyze performance. Interestingly, performance at Western States actually isn't correlated with a lot of variables. Performance at Western States depends on so many random factors: heat, nutrition, all different types of things on the day. And so we also want to bring in a wearable device. That way we can look at performance in smaller time increments, so we can see how athletes are performing over weeks, months, days, and look at the performance changes based off of these blood changes as well.
Great. So we'll wait and field some questions at the end. But Megan, you wanted to talk about another study that was a fun experiment that one of our friends and colleagues conducted recently.
So I think the amazing thing about Western States is we have a host of data at Western States. There's so much data that we can do in terms of looking at performance data, in terms of looking at time splits, looking at athletes, what are they fueling with. And we have a professor and a colleague at Stanford, actually, who ran some really interesting exploratory analyses on performance at Western States. And he did that just this week. He used linear regressions, he used multiple regressions, and we'll dive into that, and also dive into how Jim Walmsley wrecks every statistical analysis. We actually had to ask him, can you do statistical analyses first, with the whole field, and then let's exclude Jim Walmsley and see what happens. So I'm going to call up special guest David Roche, my husband. He helped with this data, and so we'll kind of go through some performance insights. Okay. And you can help me breathe too, sorry.
I'll grab it first. These are two of the most brilliant people I've ever met. Emily works with a lot of my athletes in clinic. So not only is she a great researcher, she's the best in the field at what she does. Megan's my coach, best coach in the game, and also an incredible researcher. So thank you. So fun story here. Earlier this week, Megan and I are just sitting at the couch in our Airbnb here, and we get an email from Marshall Burke, who's a brilliant professor at Stanford. He's doing world-changing work in climate change. And just between Zoom calls, he compiled all of the historic Western States data with all the weather data, all the course changes, everything like that, and sent us this huge email detailing some of the coolest results I've ever seen. It's actually really helped me coach going into the race this year. So we're going to break down how we think about it, maybe some things that help athletes that are racing along the way. So do you want to do the first graph here?
Sure. Let's dive into these. These are super cool. So these are linear regressions. We're looking at performance from 2000 and then to 2020. You can see across both men and women a steady decline in finishing time per hour. And the solid black line is the winner, and the dotted lines are the 2nd to 5th place, the average time for the 2nd to 5th place finisher. So you can see as a whole across years, and this is, we've been getting hotter and hotter and hotter. You can see this nice decline in finishing time. We're getting faster as ultramarathon runners, which is super cool. Interestingly, for women, you can see there's a nice parallel faster time performance in the top male and then the 2nd to 5th male. In women, that's actually more compressed. So you can see that actually women are staying closer to the top female finisher. I was thinking that was the Ann Trason effect. Is Ann Trason running so fast that it's hard to catch up to her? But she was actually a little bit before the 2000 era, and so that was interesting data to see.
Yeah, so I think tons of cool things here, mainly that the sport of ultra running, particularly at the front of the field, but also throughout the entire field, is progressing by leaps and bounds. So when you look at the same chart with the average finisher, you're seeing huge performance increases as well over time. And so it's really exciting. What's going on is whether it's maybe coaching, I would like to think, maybe the medical field, most likely just people, more and more athletes getting into the field, Western States getting more and more competitive, and everyone, the rising tide raising all ships.
Also, super shoes. Another possible answer for this, carbon-plated shoes, shoe technology, really getting a lot better here. I think what's interesting, though, is we're not going to see this linear decrease forever. We're not going to get to a point of 11 hours for men. I think we're going to hit a point that's just physiologically impossible. And so we're probably going to see this asymptote at some point and just kind of hit this nice flat bottom.
I like when Megan uses words like asymptote, and I'm just like, yes, I fully understand. The great thing about being a non-doctor, unlike these two, is I don't need to tell you all the limitations. I can just be like, look at this cool visualization. Okay, so after we got that first really cool graph, my question was, okay, I just want to see it without Jim Walmsley, because I've been here every year he's raced, and every single time I'm like, this is not human. maybe this is like a true outlier effect. We didn't do a true outlier test because we were keeping it a little bit more simple. But in the red there, you can see what the linear regression would look like without Jim's data included, which is pretty stunning that just in 3 finishes, he's pushing the expected winning time for men as far down as he has. And you'll see later, it's not just a small amount. It changes the predictions of what's going to happen in the heat this year pretty remarkably. So Jim Walmsley will wreck your statistical analyses is the main lesson here.
Again and again and again. So it's really interesting.
But to follow up on that, perhaps someone like Beth Pascal did last year. I mean, the way she raced in that heat was so remarkable. And that's the hard part about doing these types of quick analyses that aren't published, because most likely she is an outlier as well. It's just a little tougher to get an idea of, since that was her 1 year going off the front like that.
This is another really interesting graph, and this was actually just done in men. Marshall was busy between Zoom calls. Ideally, we would have both men and women, but as we dive into deeper of these analyses, I would love to have both genders on here. But I actually expect to see a parallel response in women. So you can see on here, there's a general increase in winning times as the temperatures increase. So heat is really having a drastic impact on winning times. What I think is interesting, though, is if you look, and it's great to actually see the years overlaid, is you look at 2018, 2021, 2013, some of the hottest years, yet there's being some really fast times run. And I think that gets to show at the caliber of ultra runners that are now competing, how we're really just like, competition is sharpening competition. We're getting faster and faster and faster. And so heat is not quite as much as an impact recently, but certainly over the last 20 years has been.
And you're seeing this effect throughout the whole field. So for women, it's very similar. For every finisher, there's some effect of heat. And the thing is here, okay, so we have the linear regression of times. We now have the heat effect. How do you combine these to get some sort of meaningful predictions for this year, knowing the forecast that's coming? And so what Marshall did is he did some multiple regression analyses, which you're the epidemiologist, but do you want to explain that? Okay, great.
Yeah, so in multiple regression, you can look at different variables and control and hold constant for different variables, which is really, really helpful. So here, and we're going to get into this multiple regression, and this is what we're going to use to predict finishing times for 2022. We'll see how close we can get. He modeled finish time as a function of year, as a function of temperature, and a function of whether or not it was a snow year. So we can go and say, okay, it's going to be 97 degrees in Auburn. It is not going to be a snow year, so we'll put that as a 0. It's binary, that's 0 or 1. And then we can use that to predict finish time. And then we'll also have year. And so that brings us to this very fun chart.
Great. So I love this chart, and this is what has changed how I'm approaching it a little bit from a coaching perspective. Also, I have to give Megan big props here because I'm wearing a mask. I am not pregnant, and I'm having trouble. I'm like, So you're doing an amazing job. So impressed. Okay, so I love this graph. So we looked at the overall winners here, and essentially look first at the middle numbers thing, where we're looking at the effect of 1 degree increase. So the male winner and the female winner both around 3 minutes. When you take out Jim's not affected by heat. The male number bumps up. Male second to fifth and female second to fifth, both about 3 minutes around there. But then what's super fascinating for me, a lot of athletes here want to be in the top 10. Like that's their dream day because that gets you a ticket back for next year. The 10th place finisher is far more affected on average with 1 degree increase in heat. That points out that if you race smart, if you're able to move in from farther back, you can sneak into the back end of the top 10 on a hot year in a much different manner than you might on a cooler year. And so that's one thing I'm really communicating to my athletes, that is their dream goal. And that doesn't just apply to those athletes, that's much more in line with how the median finisher will feel about this race. If you can race smart in the heat, take your time, practice cooling strategies, then you can have it affect you less than the model predicts. And that's when you have these bonkers good days where you can perform off the charts. Great.
And I think the really interesting thing actually about the top 10 is I think that might be largely driven by DNFs. So this was an interesting thing that we saw in this regression analysis is that there's a 0.5% increase in DNFs per every degree of heat. And I think that makes intuitive sense. We'll see a lot more drops when it's hotter. But I think actually when we have a higher proportion of athletes dropping from the race, it makes it so that the top 10, like the 10th place time, will be a little bit slower because we have more people dropping out of the top 10 and people moving in from the 18th, 19th, 20th position to take the top 10. So we're really talking to our athletes this year and saying, be patient. It's predicted to be 97 in Auburn, so be patient while you're out there, thinking about moving up steadily as you go through the field.
And I mean, where that DNF rate really, where you can really see it is in the average time of all finishers there, the 2-minute 34-second per degree. Most likely that's because the higher DNF rate means that some of the people that would have been greatly affected by the heat are now DNFing. And so the overall average, when you plop out DNFs, comes down for the average finisher. So what I'd really focus on for everyone is those 10th place finishers. It's like, okay, there's this big heat opportunity being presented when you do cooling strategies, start out easy, focus on hydration. And with predictions, I love this just from like I'm excited to see how close Marshall got. I personally like the no gym prediction for time. That's what I'm telling my athletes. And one thing that's really interesting here is just how freaking fast those times are still on a hot year. And it points out that even on hot years, people are going faster and faster and faster all the time. And it points out that heat is not destiny. While we're saying respect the heat, as coaches, we're also saying if you do these, if you race smart, if you practice cooling, heat does not have to be something that preoccupies your entire thoughts about this race. It can be a course where you can go fast and have your best day of your entire life, even on a day when it's 97. So when you wake up tomorrow and you look at that weather forecast, aim for it to be just 1 degree hotter, because that's 1 degree more of opportunity for you to have a breakthrough performance.
And I love combining coaching with the work that I do in statistics because there's actually no measure for belief in statistics. It's really, really, really hard to quantify belief and the Ted Lasso effect. But what we're telling to our athletes too is believe. Go out there, be patient, be out there to weather the heat, stay steady, stay consistent, relentless forward progress, and believe. And I wish there's some way that we could measure that in data, and perhaps we will with the support of the Western States Research Foundation, with the support of all the cool research we're doing. But I think that's going to be a key element in this year's race. So just super excited, and it's been really exciting to be here today talking about all different kinds of science. So thank you as our guest presenter. I'll bring up Emily. Thank you so much. Any questions? We certainly spanned a range of topics. We also talked about menstrual cycle and libido, so you can ask us anything. We are open books in this process, whether it's performance, endocrine biomarkers, et cetera. Yeah, go ahead. Yes, I agree with that. I think the challenge of our results was that we had a really heterogeneous population. So we had a wide range of BMIs. And that's the great thing about ultra running is that you go out to Western states and there's a wide variety of athletes who are out there competing. But the challenge with that is that when you have that heterogeneity, when you have that spread, it's really hard to have statistical power to say this finding is significant. So I think if we had bigger numbers, we would be able to find that exact finding, as you're saying. But I think it's really that we just weren't powered to see that.
That's a great question. And as Megan had mentioned earlier, we were a little disappointed to see that there wasn't a bit more of a robust finding there. But one of the other limitations was in our first round of DEXA scanning, we didn't get body fat percentage. And I think we could have probably done a little bit more with that analysis if we would have looked at body fat percentage as part of almost a Z-score like the other types of bone mineral density testing. I think looking at BMI and assessing BMI in athletes is full of challenges in general. And so I think trying to move away from BMI and move for more accurate assessments such as body fat percentage and kind of some of those other body composition assessments is going to be a lot more helpful for us. It's just a matter of like, you need a DEXA, you need a van to assess those.
We didn't see that, and I'll also say that we didn't measure that either. Sometimes the challenge with doing, we have so many different variables that we're looking at that you actually have to be careful with how many you look at, because if you're going to look at 100 variables, you expect that 5 are going to be significant by chance. And so we had to be really careful in what hypotheses we were drawing. That way we weren't looking at 200 different variables and having 10 of them be positive by chance. So we didn't actually look at that in our study. But I think certainly there's a number, as you mentioned, increasing volume too heavily. I've also seen increasing vert too heavily can be a big risk factor. Changes in footwear, low energy availability and not fueling long runs, another big risk factor. So I think there's a number of risk factors that can contribute.
Yeah, John, you're really setting us up well for our future research to really get into some of that information, because using GPS or using a Garmin to look at those fluctuations in training and that like too much too soon, and how those maybe early indicators, we kind of talk about that little niggle, maybe in the hamstring or somewhere else, so then evolves into something a lot more concerning or serious, sometimes even a bone stress injury. And for us, unfortunately, we tried to ask all these questions in a survey, but it's also self-reported. It's one snapshot, and so we couldn't ask a lot of those questions as far as volume and mileage kind of over time. And so this was kind of one question that we thought we could get accurately from an athlete who, without having them go and pour over their past 4 or 5 months of training.
That's a great question.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, interestingly, some of the other research, not performed by our team, but by some of our colleagues, have found in different athlete populations that this belief of thinner is faster or leaner is faster actually puts that athlete at greater risk of the female athlete triad and low energy availability, and even potentially future bone stress injury. And so I think, like I had mentioned, that whole idea, it's a vicious cycle. And I think a lot of athletes, they get to that sweet spot where they think that their performance is improving, and so they stay at that level, or maybe they even restrict further and kind of fly closer to the sun. And sadly, I see those athletes eventually in my clinic, either through fatigue or some other way. And so at some point they get burned, and whether it's kind of before that race or kind of in the training, but I feel like longitudinally, or the long game, is really what we try and enforce, and try and really hit home hard with our athletes and some of our translation with faster. And so we're trying to translate that information and try and empower that athlete to feel good in his or her body, as opposed to trying to compare to some picture, some idea of the perfect runner. And that perfect runner is going to look differently for all ages and distances, and really, I think it's the wrong way to look at it.
And we're also too, so now that we've seen this data, and we've seen these data across other studies too, we also want to study how to translate it. So we want to make sure that we're actually giving athletes the best message so that they can go out and actually believe it and translate that into practice. And so we actually have a translational study looking at an educational video series to make sure that's impactful and actually communicating this message. And so that's been something that's really big, is studying the translation, is just trying to quantify that exact impact too. Any other questions? Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. That's a really great question. And actually, it's something that I didn't comment on that was interesting is vitamin D levels do tend to be higher in the summer, just as you were mentioning, in terms of the sunlight being an impact for vitamin D production. And this was measured June 24th of 2019 and 2021. So these athletes probably in training for Western States were getting a lot of sun. I think realistically, a lot of athletes are supplementing for vitamin D. I think it's helpful though to get your blood tested, to work with a practitioner, to work with a coach, and just to make sure that supplementation is being guided.
Yeah, and I think I often see athletes are using supplementation too much and are not getting enough of those nutrients in their food. And sometimes when I see athletes that are low in their iron, low in their vitamin D, they are sometimes low in their overall intake. And so, sure, they may need to supplement to some degree, but I think going food first and trying to get as much from that food and then kind of topping it off with a supplement is the best approach. And really, oftentimes, it's hard in my 20, 30, 40 minutes, sometimes they go longer in my clinic, to go over all of that information. So working ideally with a sports dietitian, if the resources are there, are great. But I think we're trying to create more resources available for athletes so they can just really understand what they need from food and then go on. And I think the challenge, especially with iron supplements, is they're not well tolerated. And they can lead to constipation, they can lead to GI upset, and so we play around a lot with different supplementation strategies, and sometimes it's really hard for an athlete to stay on top of that. Great question. All right, well, thanks for everyone's attention. Hopefully you didn't feel like you were lectured at for the last 45 minutes to an hour, but we're excited and we're so honored to be co-medical research directors, and you'll be hearing more from us in the future.
Yes, I co-signed.